continuously abused the deceased. To justify that we used to bathe the deceased occasionally, that it was highly improbable, taking into account the numerous fractures and other injuries that a mother or a caregiver would not be able to notice. You had a legal duty to protect the deceased against accusing of harm. However, you decided to turn a blind eye.
3 years down the line, I feel that has been day after day throwing salt in our wounds all the time since the first day. I remember it was a Monday. I remember it was like it was yesterday, a Monday, when we learned this horrible thing that happened to my nephew. At the moment, I'm frustrated. Very frustrated at the justice system. Like I said to you previously, to me, this is not even about my nephew anymore. He's gone. He's at peace. He's at rest. Nobody can harm him no more. What he's been through is no longer. This is now my struggle for the future generation. Because this hasn't gotten any better since the day my nephew was murdered brutally. It wasn't a stranger. He wasn't kidnapped. It happened in their home.
Hi everyone, welcome to or welcome back to my channel, and thank you very much for joining me here again today. Last week we spoke about the very upsetting case of Yannicka Marlowe and how her case has still not been solved and her killer or killers can still be out there roaming the streets. And we really hope that justice is served for Yannicka and her family. And if that case was not horrific enough, the case we are going to talk about today was suggested to me, and this case is about a young boy named Jeremiah Ruiters. And there have been a lot of cases that have rattled me that we've spoken about here on this channel and that have made me quite emotional and quite upset. But after reading about this case is definitely quite high up there. But let me just give you some forewarning that when we talk about the autopsy later on in this case, it is absolutely gut-wrenching, but we will get into that later. But for now, let's not reveal too much and let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Today we are heading to an area in Cape Town called Windermere, specifically Salamander Square. And living here is a young boy named Jeremiah Ruiters who lived with his mom and 2 siblings. One of his siblings was aged 8 at the time and the other aged 3. At the time, Jeremiah Ruiters was 18 months. And because all of the children were all under the age of 18, those who survived were not named to protect their identity and privacy. Jeremiah's mom is named Abigail Ruiters, and it seems as though Abigail had her 3 children with another man, and she and this other man separated, and she was now a single mom of 3, until she met a man named Amiruddin Peters. At first, things were great with Amiruddin and Abigail, and they were living a very happy life in their home with the 3 children. But we know all too often that things change quite quickly on this channel, and sadly there was no difference in this case. So things started to escalate quite quickly in the Ruiters household, and especially between the 3 children and Amiruddin. It seems as though Amiruddin would be very frustrated. He would come home frustrated and he would take it out on the children, and he would first start by shouting at them, screaming at them, smacking them when they were a bit naughty. But for some reason, this line between being very strict and becoming very physical with the children blurred very quickly, and the amount of cruelty, violence, and pure ignorance that escalated from Amiruddin was completely uncalled for and actually quite shocking. But it seems as though Amiruddin would take most of his frustrations out on baby Jeremiah, but that's not to say that the other children didn't experience the amount of violence as well from Amiruddin, but most of it was taken out on young Jeremiah. And before we get into exactly what happened, you might be asking, okay, but where's the mom, Abigail? Well, she was there. Sometimes. Most of the time, Abigail was apparently at work, and then she would leave Amiruddin as the main caregiver for her 3 children. And the people who knew the Ruiter children would often say that they were mostly dirty. They had a lot of dirt under their fingernails. They had a lot of dirt on their face. And yeah, that might be quite common with children, which it is. But every time they saw them, they were dirty. Their clothes were dirty. They were often very hungry. And what mostly struck the people who knew the Ruiter family was that they were mostly always alone. And this is quite similar to the case of Poppy van der Merwe, which we spoke about a couple of videos ago. And this case is quite similar because sadly, tragedy will strike when young children are left alone with people who you assume that they can trust. Okay, so just to let you know what transpires next is quite graphic, but in March of 2017, Abigail apparently got a job that required her to be away a lot of the time, so she would often leave Jeremiah and his siblings in the care of Amiruddin. And it seems like Amiruddin didn't work, and that's why he was able to be the primary caregiver for the children, but he may have worked or he may have left the children alone quite often, as mentioned by the neighbors and people who knew the Ruiters that they were most often alone. But Abigail going to work caused a lot of tension between her and Amiruddin, because it may have been because Abigail was away most of the time and he was stuck at home looking after the 3 children, when she would say that she would go away for work for one day, but she would often come back weeks later. And Amiruddin would say that he would get very frustrated with Abigail because she would just walk into the house like nothing ever changed. She would then just walk in, say hello to her children, and just carry on like life was completely normal, and that she hadn't just left the children and Amiruddin alone for like 2 weeks. Late at night on the 12th of June 2017, Amiruddin Peters starts running towards Kensington Clinic, where he's now holding the seemingly lifeless body of Jeremiah Ruiters. Amiruddin said that Jeremiah suffered what apparently looked like a seizure of some kind, so he then wrapped up Jeremiah. He told Abigail, him and Abigail then left to go towards the clinic. And apparently this was not the first time that Amiruddin had brought young Jeremiah to this clinic to be looked at. The doctors who had previously treated Jeremiah had flagged him down twice that something may be wrong and that social workers need to look into this case. And I'll show you snippets of a timeline, and it seems like when Jeremiah was left in the care alone with Amiruddin from March of 2017, it seems like shortly after things would slowly start happening to young 18-month-old Jeremiah. And you can see that he was brought into the clinic twice for quite serious injuries. The doctors flagged that the social workers were sent out only once to have a look. And when the social workers did go to the Ruiter household, they did an inspection and apparently everything looked fine. Abigail and Amiruddin put on smiley, happy faces, and the social workers were then happy to give Jeremiah back to Abigail and Amiruddin. But when the social workers gave young Jeremiah back to Abigail in order to protect him and to make sure that nothing happened to him, clearly protecting her son was not the thing that was on the top of her head. Because sadly, the whole system failed young Jeremiah, starting with the people who were supposed to protect him. So when Amiruddin arrived and handed Jeremiah over to the doctors and nurses that were there, sadly, he was declared dead on arrival. And when doctors looked over Jeremiah's body, they saw some things that immediately made them call the police. Amiruddin was quickly taken into custody, and so was Abigail, and they were later then charged with the murder of Jeremiah Ruiters. Jeremiah's body was taken to the morgue to determine the cause of death because of the amount of injuries on his body. The doctors were unsure what exactly caused it, and in November of 2017, the trial for Abigail Ruiters and Amiruddin Peters started, and they both pled not guilty. When Abigail walked into court, she smiled and waved at her family like nothing happened, and Amiruddin was sullen and said nothing. He just looked down and kept to himself. When the trial started, the doctors did come back to try and determine the cause of death of Jeremiah. And the autopsy and exactly what they found that happened to Jeremiah is one of the worst things I've ever heard. But one last thing before we get into that, they did ask Amiruddin why Jeremiah had so many bruises on his body when he was brought into the Kensington Clinic when he apparently had that seizure. And what Amiruddin said was that apparently he was running into the clinic and he had Jeremiah wrapped up in like a blanket or a jacket, and apparently he then dropped Jeremiah. And then because Jeremiah had now fallen onto the floor, Amiruddin apparently stumbled over Jeremiah and fell over him and then landed on 18-month-old Jeremiah. So apparently that's why he had so many bruises on his body. But Dr. Marna Duplessis conducted the post-mortem on Jeremiah Ruiters, and she provided quite a clear picture of the extent and horrific injuries that Jeremiah Ruiters was exposed to. Dr. Marna Duplessis testified that Jeremiah had a total of 14 fractures to his rib cage. He also had severe injuries to his head, which in her opinion were caused by direct blunt force trauma, and a significant force was used to inflict these injuries, which she said, quote, he had 4 areas of bleeding underneath his skin, 3 of which were fresh. I noted one previous area of bleeding underneath the skin on the left forehead, which was about 7 days old. He also had 4 extensive fresh fractures on his head. These injuries were not caused by a fall. They were caused by separate blows that were inflicted to the head. The one right on top of Jeremiah's head fits with the scenario where he was held by his legs and dropped on his head. End quote. Dr. Mana Duplessis also added that he had fresh bleeding inside his chest cavity. He also had fresh bleeding in the lining of his heart. And Dr. Mana Duplessis also found extensive injuries to his abdominal area, round about where his tummy is, and she indicated that this may have been from consistent punching or kicking or standing on the baby's tummy. She also said that he had fresh bleeding to his kidneys, also as a result from blunt force trauma, as well as fresh bleeding to his bladder because of the same result. And if it couldn't get any worse for young 18-month-old Jeremiah, he also had a completely severed and broken spine right at the bottom, and doctors couldn't really determine exactly what caused it, but they assumed that it was because of extensive beating, kicking, throwing. And doctors also found that he had extensive injuries to his private area and that he had been. And the doctor said the injuries to his private area were so extensive that it is incredibly unlikely that his mom, who was most likely changing his nappies, or at least anyone who was changing Jeremiah's nappies, would not notice how bloody and bruised it was. And the reason why Dr. Mana Duplessis said that it is practically impossible that no one would notice this is because during the entire trial, Abigail Ruiters denied ever noticing any bruises, broken bones, bloody private areas on Jeremiah. And Dr. Mana would pipe up and say, actually, it's quite impossible that you wouldn't notice any type of pain on your baby. Because she said that Jeremiah would be completely distressed and crying in a lot of pain. And the people who were actually in court listening to exactly what happened to baby Jeremiah, they were crying and sobbing and screaming in anguish. But Abigail and Amiruddin just sat there. There was nothing going on. And Abigail didn't even have one tear for Jeremiah during the entire trial. In the end, Abigail Ruiters was sentenced to 6 years behind bars for child neglect, and only 3 of these years would need to be spent behind bars. The rest would be suspended sentence. Amiruddin Peters has been sentenced to life behind bars for the rape of Jeremiah Ruiters, 15 years for his murder, and 6 years for child abuse. And I don't know if anything can be worse than what we've just heard. However, when Abigail was on trial and being sentenced, she was actually pregnant with Amiruddin's baby, and she did have the baby in prison. And the only time she cried was when she knew that the baby, which was actually a girl, when she knew that her young daughter was going to be taken away from her. She didn't cry or make any noise when she heard what happened to Jeremiah, but she cried when her newborn was going to be taken away. And even if you really didn't know what was happening behind closed doors to your child by your partner or your lover, when you hear what happened to them and the extent of their injuries, I would have assumed that she would have had some kind of reaction. But Abigail's daughter was handed to her mom. Then for some reason she is now in foster care, but this could just be because of the legalities and everything that needs to be settled. So I don't know. Do I really believe that she saw nothing and didn't see a single bruise on her child's body? No, I don't believe it. Because you can't tell me that an 18-month-old baby can change their own nappy. Even the people who were changing his nappy wouldn't notice anything on that young boy. Especially with how Dr. Mana Duplessis described the intense injuries that were everywhere on his body. And if you know someone who's broken a rib, it is incredibly painful. You can't cough, you can't sneeze, you can't laugh. There's nothing happening. So imagine the pain that Jeremiah must have been in when he was crying because of all these injuries, not understanding that crying obviously makes it worse, but him even having to be in that position in the first place. It just absolutely boggles my mind and upsets me very much. But this case is absolutely devastating, disheartening, discouraging, and disgusting. And the reason why I say it's disgusting is because of what happened, but also because we're still doing this. People are still hurting babies and children in such ways. And just like Poppy van der Merwe, just like Yannick Amalo, just like Tarek Jacobs, and the 3 Dickerson children, we can go on forever with how many cases we've spoken about on this channel. But clearly things are not going to change unless there is a bigger change, and it just makes me sad because it looks like we're a far way away from that. But there's always hope and there's always ability to change, so here's hoping. But before I get even more riled up, let me love and leave you. I hope you all have a great day further and a super fantastic weekend. Thank you for all your kindness, love, and support. I appreciate all of you. And thank you for all your suggestions. I really appreciate them. Please stay safe out there. Please stay well. And I'll see you again next week. Bye.